Hello, everybody. It is Miss Gooding, and I am here to talk a little bit about the rise of the Populist Party at the very end of the 1800s, a really interesting time in U.S. history that doesn't get a whole lot of attention traditionally. So that's why I really like spending a little bit of time on that. Okay, so here we go. All right, first of all, I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about how farmers really struggled during this time. There was an economic crisis, a recession of sorts. And, before I get to talking about that, you have to imagine that being a farmer in the United States was pretty stressful at this time. During the Gilded Age, there were many, many people moving into the cities and working factories. And so the sheer um, volume that farmers were required to produce was really quite overwhelming because not everybody was growing their own food anymore. Um, and so, there were a lot of problems, a lot of stress. And so in the 80s, Granges became a thing where farmers were kind of isolated. They were on many, many acres or many, many miles of their own property, and they were pretty isolated from one another. And so Granges were something that, came into being um, because farmers needed to socialize and they needed education and they needed professional development of sorts. And so it was, a time of great change for farmers. So a couple of pictures of family life in Nebraska in 1888, and then rail workers at a coal chute in the 1800s. But predominantly, some of these issues, financial issues that farmers were having, is that prices for crops were dropping in the late 1800s. They were also forced, in order to make the payments for some of the crops that they, and seeds and things that they needed, and farm equipment, they had to take out these really, really high interest loans. And they weren't always able to pay them back. It was incredibly stressful for them to do so. Railroads were also charging incredibly high prices. Regulations from the government had not really been started at this time, and so farmers were having to pay a lot of money in order to transport their goods across the country. And so a lot of these farmers were using the Grange and using the Farmers Alliance eventually in order to have their needs met and to be heard, and to have their needs addressed by the government. So these discontented farmers, before they were able to really have a voice, they were blaming the banks and they were blaming the railroads for a lot of their problems. And a Granger-inspired lithograph, just for you, primary source for you. So, like I was mentioning, farmers started Granges, and these Granges are in a lot of rural areas. Here in our community, we have the Dry Creek Grange and we have the Mount Pleasant Grange, and we have quite a few of them still around. But through these Granges, farmers started to receive economic help, social help. There were, events that they could attend. They received education, and they promoted a lot of state laws to also regulate the railroad prices. Also, the Farmers Alliance that started in the 1880s was also very, very helpful for farmers with their problems. And so they became more politically active. They really needed to be politically active in order for their voices to be heard. And so they ended up supporting a lot of the politicians that were listening to them and that were willing to really support them with regards to their finances, their issues with finances, and also the railroad and banks. So the Farmers Alliance really did turn into a populist party. So populism is, and this is a picture of the Populist Party convention in Nebraska. But populism is a really important term, and there have been multiple populist groups, and there have been some even fairly recently. But populism is defined here as a political ideology that emphasizes the idea of the people and juxtaposes this group against the elite. So they are anti-elite and anti-establishment in in general. Anti-establishment is basically they are anti the people that have been in government for a long, long time. and they like new ideas. And they generally are fairly liberal, but that is not always the case. In the presidential election of 1892, you can see kind of who was running. It was Cleveland, Harrison, and Weaver, and the populist candidate was Weaver. And you can see that Weaver did not win, obviously, um, but Cleveland, the Democrat, won in 1892. But Weaver did do pretty well for being a third party candidate. And the reason that he was able to do well is because there were so many farmers and populist supporters behind him. And so you see that this is also the case in 1896. It worked out a little bit differently in 1896. Okay, so the Populist Party drew up a platform in 1892 for their presidential election. And so Weaver really communicated that he would expand the supply of money by coining more silver and gold, creating more for the economy. And yeah, it does create inflation, but at the same time, farmers desperately needed that money. Government. He also was on a platform of government ownership of the railroad, and that would actually put them in a position where the government could subsidize and they could also control the rates that farmers were paying. He also ran on a platform of implementation of an income tax, so that wealthier people, the people that made more money, were paying more taxes, and the people that were making less money, because it's all based on income, and if you make more money, you pay more, and if you make less money, you pay less income tax. And so they were really hoping that that would be something that would be implemented. Weaver did not win, but like I said before, had a lot of success. In 1896, it was the two major party candidates were Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan and Republican candidate William McKinley. And this was slightly different. There was a populist movement still, and they backed the Democrats. Okay, they backed the Democratic candidate, which was William Jennings Bryan. So it was William Jennings Bryan versus William McKinley. Bryan, who was the Democrat, was backed by the Populist Party. McKinley supported the big business and banks, and it ended up that McKinley won this presidency. But at this point in time, the influence of the Populist Party did decline, and but it didn't go away. You know, there were still people that definitely supported farmers, and there were still people that really wanted the people to be heard. And so that didn't go away. It's just that the Populist Party was absorbed by the Democratic Party, and they ended up losing the election. And so McKinley came in and was somebody that supported the railroads and supported business and things like that. But things will change once we hit the progressive movement. All right. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it.